Module 9, Enforcement. Which agencies are responsible for enforcing arms transfer controls?
Mostly the survey was completed by consulting with other ministries that sort of own the relevant legislation. So the Ministry for Justice, the Ministry for Finance, the licensing authority, a number of agencies, because the legislation that governs enforcement is spread out. As far as possible, we want to use the normal national legislation on criminal offences. So, for instance, if someone falsifies an end-user certificate, we would use the normal criminal law for that. But there are some specific items that are in the law for export control. So when we were doing this, we needed to talk to our licensing authority, who are responsible for monitoring certain kinds of offences, and we needed to talk to our normal criminal law bodies, who are responsible for enforcing the normal body of criminal law.
Is the relevant legislation located online?
We have a national website for the licensing authority, and then there's the general government website for general legislation. It's publicly available, and the way our legal system is set up, John Public is supposed to be aware of the legislation. It's not an excuse to say, oh, I didn't know that was criminalized.
What measures to enforce transfer controls are included in relevant legislation or policy guidelines?
And some of the enforcement clauses are in the actual legislation for exports. But most of it is simply our normal criminal legislation. So, for instance, if you falsify an end-user certificate, there's nothing specific in the export control law about that. We just fall back on the general legislation in the area. So, apart from the licensing authority for the export control specific penalties and criminalizations, we have the police, the ordinary prosecution agency, the Ministry for Justice. There could be, from time to time, involvement of financial authorities, such as those in investigating financial crimes. So there's a host of different legislations that need to be described, at least in the form of an overview, that the measures and the penalties are spread all over our legal system, because we want to make use of the general criminal law as much as possible, rather than duplicating it in each area. So there are a few specific elements that are mentioned in the legislation on export control, but most of it comes out of our general legislation.
As I mentioned, in the Philippines, enforcement is kind of fragmented. So we have to form interagency bodies, but of course that takes time to convene and for them to deliberate and so on and so forth. According to that bill that we're planning to pass in Congress, there will be a central agency called the Strategic Trade Management Office that will manage all activities related to the arms trade treaty, not just transit and transshipment, but import-export, re-exports, brokering, and other types of transfers. So there will be a central agency, and they will be linked up with all the other implementing agencies: customs, police, military, defense, justice, and the other law enforcement agencies will have to go through the central agency. So it will. The plan is really to create an interagency, interbody unit that will be more efficient for government and will also be more, at least less time consuming for the industry and other players who are requesting for those permits or authorizations.
The enforcement, like any other legislation, if there's a crime that has been committed, there is a particular enforcement process that you follow. You shall have a detection of a possible crime. You shall have the police to investigate that. You may have to ask your prosecuting authority to make a determination whether there's a case to follow. And if there is a case to follow, prosecution will happen, and there shall be a judgment given, whether it's imprisonment, whether it's a fine. But there is a whole regime that is in place to deal with possible offences under a legislation.
States must explain how they fulfil their ATT commitments with regard to enforcement. States must provide information on the relevant agencies for enforcing arms transfer controls and preventing or addressing diversion, measures for enforcing national laws and regulations that implement the provisions of the treaty. This can include sanctions and penalties at both the administrative and criminal levels.